You're going to want to read that to see if the science is right, because I'm going to spend about 60 seconds on the science. Okay, we ready? Can I get me instead of Josh? No offense, Josh. Josh, I gave you my time on this. I'm going to try it as soon as we say go. Okay. And me. Ah, we pinned me. So later we'll pin Josh. Thank you. Okay. How do I? Mouse? I just need the next slide. Okay, there we go. So what do I use? Arrows? Okay. This was born from a whole different project, which is a whole other story, but I'm just going to launch into this one. I'm obsessed with timelines and memory. And I wanted to know, how does an audience remember a timeline? Because you can't schematize that. It's a one-off thing, a historical timeline. So I got deep. But just imagine, long after you put down a book, you can ask the same question. How do you remember the plot of a book or a movie? How do you remember what your grandfather said about the 40s? Or his life story, as it were? Is everyone seeing, can we lose the gray? Because all my headings are there. I'm going to keep talking while you work on it. There's 3 points I want you to think of as we go here, and I'm going to use as a heuristic device here. I'm going to distinguish between recall and remembering just for the sake of discussion. So you actually don't remember everything. We know this, but your memory comes in fragments. You retrieve information in fragmented form, and we can use the word recall to refer to that today. But then remembering is constructive. You piece it together. You decide how it fits. Sometimes you guess or make inferences. And then because of those 2 things, is the 3rd point here, is you wind up with distortions. Now, distortion can be really bad, like a confabulation is a type of cognitive distortion that's tantamount to falsification. But it could also just mean a synopsis. A synopsis is a distortion. So there's a wide range on that. That's for your party favor. Enough with the cog psych. Except for William Friedman. He's my hero. Friedman said, and there's been an explosion of interest, well, relative explosion of interest in him in the last 5 years in various ways. But Friedman said basically, when you're recalling your fragments, some of them are going to have temporal implications. Some of them are going to indicate for you where they belong in connection with a recognized pattern of time or a specific event. So you can correlate or you can compare before, during, after. So we could define temporal content as stuff that implies its own sequence. These are Friedman's examples in his literature. If you're trying to remember the last time you saw your friend John, oh, it was at Susie's birthday party. She turned such and such years old. It was in January. That's how you date that event in your personal history. Where were you when 9/11 happened? I was teaching high school in Georgia. When this one here, when recall that X occurring evoked similar event Y. When Chernobyl happened, people said it reminded them of 3 Mile Island. I hope I've got that in the right order. But people who lived through it and remembered, you know, the memory of remembering indicates temporal sequence. So you can also do this with stages of human growth and personal development. That's a big one that covers, those are my terms, not Friedman's, just to cover a lot of his examples. And then this red one over on the side, you can have false information that seems to connect to a time pattern or known event. You can also have true information that sort of falsely implies. So there's problems here, but this is what we're working with. This is what we got. These you can look at when you get a chance. It's just, the point here is that there's various levels of detail. This map of Eastern, Northeast Europe is obviously just sort of narrows it down roughly, right? We work with what we got. The information tells us what it tells us. Here's a quick detour. I love this as art, and it's a metaphor for my message today. Ernie Bushmiller was a famous minimalist as an artist. Every time someone walked in the Nancy comic strip, their legs are at a 90-degree angle, and you can see that in these examples. In the strip at the bottom, the story calls for a woman with a long winter coat to shield Sluggo from the snowball mafia here. But Bushmiller has a problem. He needs to draw a 90-degree walking angle. So he makes her legs pivot below the knees. It's a strategic distortion, right? You lose a little bit of information, or you falsify a little bit in order to convey something else. So with that in mind, here's the new and improved title for today's presentation, now with overarching theme. We're going to trade off accuracy for preservation of a sequence. Causality is the first example. I talked a little bit about this one 2 years ago at the online only conference. Forster gave us a great gift with this, the of grief, making it a plot or a story, not just a chronicle. But I think you can actually measure chronicle, or hypothetically, we could work on this and develop a way to measure coherence, is what I meant to say, in terms of reconstructive efficiency, hypothetically. And I should say all of this could be reformulated in terms of information theory, I think. My elaborate hypothesis today. But if you see on the left here, you've got to recall each of these things distinctly. Once we inject, over on the right, once we inject causality, it all sort of gets lumped in together. One thing evokes the other, one death reminds you of the other, and the causality, and this is the big point, implies sequence, the temporal sequence again, being my central point. You can do it with longer chains of events. You can start at the beginning, the middle, or the end. Now, I want to quickly distinguish, we've had research for years and years about, decades, I think, about how stories make details sticky, right? And because there's connectedness in stories. And so, you know, a detail in a story is easy to remember because it's connected to lots of things. So mnemonic associations is part of what I'm talking about today, but it's not the main point. I couldn't find anyone else centering a temporal sequence in terms of memory for, you know, the past. And so this is what I'm working up as we go. One of the big points I'd like to leave you with today is that I believe this works exactly the same way in our minds, whether we're dealing with fiction, nonfiction, or autobiography. And I think that's just wild, because your brain doesn't necessarily go verify the factuality of anything. If you encode an event as having happened, hypothetically or actually, then the information, as Friedman said, will imply its own sequence, or else it won't. So you can go through these examples. Everyone is a delightful rabbit trail. But again, let me point out Yoko Ono here. Poor Yoko. Absolutely terrible myth, but there is a true timeline underneath it. And that's the kind of stuff that interests me, is that's why it sells, right? So sometimes these distortions have a little bit underneath that's worth studying. Okay, sorry about the headings for everybody online, but you've got it's okay. Everybody's got a handout. The second of my three categories, which we could also call informational patterns of temporal implications, or just informational patterns, is location. We've also got a little bit of causality going on here. If you just think about the fact that moving from point A to point B implies that time has passed. But it's not as strong a sense of causality. Again, it just depends on how your mind encodes the content. At least I think it does. And then location is always an available context for, you know, forming memories. And so you can use locations that way. The three examples at the bottom here, obviously the itinerary-based nature of those plot lines does not summarize the whole plot, does not account for the entire implotment of those stories, but there's sort of an underlying backbone that helps you keep track of it. The diagram here on the left is how I envision that this actually happens in your mind. You actually hold on to the information. You can group it according to location, everything that happens to Dorothy in this place, everything that happens to Dorothy in that place. And then the diagram on the left represents a way that you could organize the material by relying on little hints and clues, little logical implications, bits of contingency or continuity, like the Kansas house winds up in Munchkinland, the road starts in Munchkinland. And so you have little connections and you can sequence by chunking. You'll notice here, if you look closely, this isn't perfect either, but again, we work with what we got. And any accommodation helps our poor struggling brains, because you got to both juggle all the information and put it together. Sometimes that's a lot. We can do the same thing with historical biographies or my autobiography. I've moved around a lot, so that's kind of how I tend to segment my life. It's there's distortions there too, but it's what we tend to do. Jesus in the Gospels, I could talk about this for 20 minutes. The first 3 canonical Gospels put all of his popular stuff in one place, and then at the end, when he goes down to die, that's all the time he has to spend in that place. And then the 4th canonical Gospel, according to John, sort of complicates that, has him going up and down and up and down, which is true. That's a different discussion. But I think this one happens to represent the way it was naturally remembered. Who was he? He was a popular teacher in Galilee. He got killed in Jerusalem. What's his timeline? Same answer. That's what we work with what we got. Again, each one of these is a delightful rabbit trail. We perceive correlations of space and time. We perceive anything that implies time passing. Whenever I was in a history class, I loved the maps, especially the maps with the arrows. That's when I started to feel like I could get a foothold, right? Just like the bubbles, the mind map of the Julius Caesar timeline a minute ago, that was wildly distorted. But we start where we can. We hold on to what the mind is capable of holding on to. Here's category number 3, disruption. That should say how disruption implies sequence. For the narratology convention, this should be a very familiar list of triads from Gerald Prince's definition of events, and you can throw in Freytag's triangle, you can throw in Aristotle's reversal, anything that our mind can fixate on that sort of defines the difference between before and after. Again, it's not about precision or accuracy, it's about facility or adaptiveness. We do the same thing, I believe, with nonfiction content. The Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, these are not only metaphors and constructions, these are disruptions. They're also periodized. They're well, rabbit trail. I'm rabbit trailing. But, before the Renaissance, everything was dark. Before the Reformation, everyone was Catholic. And before the Enlightenment, everyone was stupid. We know that's not, precisely true. And I'm giving you the elementary version, but it's surprising the level that, like, historians still argue about whether or not the Renaissance really happened. Was it a thing or is it an idea? And so we cling to these modes of sequencing time as a way of being able to comprehend the past. I could say the same thing for each one of these individuals. There's a popular narrative right now that Ronald Reagan ruined everything about America, and it feels very true from a certain perspective. I wouldn't argue that it isn't, but of course the reality is far more complicated. So part of what I'm trying to propose at the end of my talk today is that you can use the simple story as an opener and then complicate it. But you give students, or God forbid, the general public, for public service, something to hold on to, something they can cohere with, and then you develop. Because, at the bottom there, that's, of course, the Marxist view, which is accurate, but you can't grasp all the complexities of what was actually going on socioeconomically at a given place and time. Personal disruptions. Here's autobiography. Every one of these deserves its own talk here. And some of these were when I was first starting to brainstorm types of things that would work with Friedman's model. I came up with a lot of these distinctly, and then I was like, oh, that's all the same thing. And then I was like, oh, that's literary theory. What have I stumbled into? So there's all these different ways that we perceive an event, whether it's good news or bad news, something that's transformative or something that's traumatic, and it defines in our memory. Just 9/11. I can't pick people up at the airport anymore. Every time I go to the airport, I remember 9/11 because of that. There's just a million ways this works. This is a very crude diagram of what I think, how I think we might represent it. The before time, there's a bunch of different nodes in this net that sort of connect all the stuff about what life was like, say, before the pandemic. And then there's a whole nother set of connections about what life was like after the pandemic. not every one of these nodes connects directly to the disruption. This is not just a form of causality blown up wide. This is, as it says on the slide, this is correlation, but it's geometric. It's sequential, but, well, I'm still trying to figure out what it is. But this is, again, this is the best I got at the moment here. The old expectations persist, and so, you know, I drive around the corner where grandma used to be, and I miss her. The absence evokes the former presence. All of these ways in which memory defines how we think about the past. I said that category 3 is not the same as category 1. Conflict's not the same as, disruption is not the same thing as causality, in my opinion, but it is very similar to location because of the way we use it. We periodize, just like Dorothy or Jesus with the geography, we periodize our lives according to situations. The time when so-and-so was in the hospital, the time when I worked at that place, a million examples you can come up with. And then Friedman actually used the term landmarks, I think, and several other psychologists have since. I got two sets of ideas about conclusions here. In summary, if we look to the past, I suspect that if I'm on to something here about the ways, and these are the major ways in which our minds encapsulate sequence in remembering the past, I don't think it's coincidence that story developed in such a way as to highlight conflict and plot and setting. And then again, Friedman had, you remember Friedman's examples were familiar patterns of human growth and development. That's character. So to me, there's something really enticing here that deserves further research. And then more importantly, looking forward, is the strategic distortion. And I have several ideas about how to use this. But basically, if we take seriously, this is my final slide, if we take very seriously the fact that an audience, especially a listening audience, like such as yourselves, you know, you'll retain more from this if I was successfully able to give you one major point and several examples of it. I hope that's what I just did. How do we do this for pedagogy? How do we do this for public good, for public service? I think there's a lot of things we can explore, and I'm excited about it. And just to close out here, I really feel like the guy in Israel, Palestine, who was the goat herd who stumbled into the cave and found the clay pot. And he's like, what is this? And then they had the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I hope this will generate some interest. I drive a truck, and I spend every free moment on this stuff. Thank you for listening.